Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Hart Bennett, and today I'm going to read Chapter 41 from Seven Sisters, The Trek. The Saints traveled with hardly any major difficulties for the next several days. The worst problems they encountered were hundreds of mosquitoes pestering them to tears in the evenings. The only solution was to keep moving at their nightly dances. The Cardiff band was always generous to play for an hour after supper each night, and even though the Saints walked many miles each day, they loved to do a little hoofing, as the teamsters referred to it. Everyone clapped or moved in time to the music. One night, in the midst of their merrymaking, a little wind kicked up. It had been calm all day, and they really didn't mind the wind at all because it helped keep the mosquitoes away. The dancers continued with their fun, but the wind built in ferocity. Huge gusts swept through the camp and surprised the dancers with their force. They picked up dirt and sand, and soon the women and children were squealing and screaming because little objects were hitting them. "Brothers and sisters, we better take care of our tents," yelled Captain MacArthur. No one had to be told twice. They began running to secure their tents, which were starting to do their own herky-jerky dances in the wind. Some were blown over and had uprooted stakes that allowed the canvas to flap loudly. It was beginning to be difficult to stand up against the wind, and its roaring made it hard to communicate. "That's one way to get rid of the mosquitoes," laughed Lavinia as the sisters all clambered into their tent. "Let's hope it doesn't uproot our tent, too," said Caroline. "Everyone sit on the bottom edge to hold it down." The sisters obeyed as the top of their tent swayed back and forth angrily. Caroline lit one of the candles they had acquired on the Canadian train ride and set it in the center of the dirt floor. The flame flickered a little with the draft that was moving through the tent. "Aren't you glad we have candles for just such an occasion as this?" she said. They all agreed, recalling their time as the Candle Brigade. The windstorm gained in violence, and loud raindrops started smacking their tent. It almost sounded like there was an audience outside clapping for a performance. Most of the windstorms they had encountered so far while camping or trekking had passed quickly, but this one was still going strong after 20 minutes. "Can we go to bed yet?" pleaded Phoebe. Susanna could see that this was a good idea. "Yes, why don't you two lie down? I think we can keep the tent from being blown over without you." Phoebe and Fanny were grateful that they had been dismissed, but when they started crawling toward the center of the tent, they began to squeal. "Oh, my bottom is all wet!" exclaimed Phoebe. "Me too," said Fanny as she felt the back of her skirt. "We've been sitting in a puddle of water and didn't even know it." "My word, the water is seeping in under the tent everywhere," Caroline said with alarm. "I'm going to be swimming if we don't do something." "We're going to be swimming if we don't do something," said Eleanor. Caroline made a decision. "Everyone try to scrape as much dirt as you can around the edges of our bedding and push it up against the inside of the tent. We'll see if we can make a little dam. I'm going out to see if I can dig a ditch around our tent to give the water someplace else to go." "I'll go with you," said Eleanor, searching through their belongings to find tin cups. Caroline didn't know what they would find outside their tent, but bravely ventured forth. It was impossible to see much in the dark. The wind had died down a little, but the rain was still pouring down, and the temperature had dropped. They immediately became drenched and cold. "You take that side," yelled Caroline. They felt their way along the tent. The ground was quite muddy. They not only had to dig the trench, but they also had to battle their skirts as well. Thankfully, it wasn't too hard to move the mud and rocks with their hands and cups until they made a little trench all the way around the tent. Then they dug a few feet farther toward a little ravine, so the water that fell into the ditch would drain off in that direction. It was miserable, muddy work, but the two finally finished and staggered back into the tent. "How was it out there?" asked Aunt Lucy. "Take miserable and multiply it tenfold," said Eleanor, trying to wring out her skirt. "I think the water has quit coming in with our damming and your ditching," said Lavinia, chuckling with her alliteration. Aunt Lucy noticed Caroline and Eleanor were starting to shiver. "You two need to get out of those wet, muddy clothes and into something dry. Then we all better try to get some sleep." It all sounded good in theory, but even though they had stopped the water from seeping under the tent walls, the canvas overhead was getting so saturated that drops of water were forming and falling down randomly from above. They finally just pulled their quilts over their heads and spent the rest of the night in their soggy blankets. They awoke the next morning to the trumpeter's call. "Who wants to peek out of the tent and see if it looks like it's finished raining for the day, or if we're in for more testing?" said Lavinia. Aunt Lucy was closest to the tent flap and volunteered. Upon her return, she announced, "It looks like there's some blue sky over in the west coming our way. I think we can start hanging up our wet bedding outside." The sisters grabbed their wet things and started out the door, only to find that their shoes sank into the mud with every step. "This is a muddy mess out here," said Caroline. "I don't think we'll be traveling today, or maybe even tomorrow." This was confirmed by Captain Pinkerton, who came to their tent a few minutes later. "Sisters, Captain Mack has given us orders to spread the word we're going to lay by today until the ground dries out so the oxen can pull the wagons easier. We want to avoid double and triple teaming as much as we can. Also, the river is swollen, and we need to wait until it goes down a little because we have to cross it in a few miles ahead. So make the most of your day." "Thank you, Captain Pinkerton. We'll try," said Lavinia. The sisters were grateful for the day off from walking, but they knew they would be just as busy around the camp, cleaning up all the devastation from the wind and rainstorm. They also needed to work on the trench around their tent in case it started raining again. Eleanor was restless. "I'll be back in a few minutes, sisters," she said to the others. They could see she wanted to be alone, so they didn't impose themselves on her. There was a small hill a little way behind the wagon, and she felt if she walked to the top of it, she could see in all directions and analyze the weather conditions better. Upon reaching the top, she looked west at the Rocky Mountains they would be traveling through in a day or two. They were so beautiful, but were starting to get snow on the peaks. Everyone was hoping and praying that the weather would stay nice until they arrived in the valley. She turned toward the camp and followed the landscape back and forth with her eyes to see the destruction of the storm the night before. Nearly all the wagons had their covers blown part way or all the way off, and there were items that had been blown out of the wagons and strewn around. There was beginning to be a flurry of activity around the camp as the saints went to work, picking their way through the mud to clean up and tie everything down that had blown loose. She watched them for a few minutes and was surprised at how quickly the camp was returning to normal, with the exception of lots of puddles. The rain did put a nice fresh look on everything and gave a lovely smell to the dirt and the sagebrush, but it was always a tedious job to get everything dried out after a storm. The teamsters would use the day to replace shoes on the oxen. She drew her shawl closer around her shoulders to keep off the chill of the wind. Then she got the notion to say her morning prayers. She was far enough away from the others that she could kneel down and without anyone noticing her. She found a rock to lean on. As she knelt there in silence, she didn't know what to pray for. Then it came to her. "Thank you, dear Lord. Thank you for everything," was all she could manage to get out before tears began to flow. She thought of the many blessings she had received on this journey. She clenched her hands tighter together. She didn't feel like she could ask for any more blessings at this time. She would just thank Heavenly Father for everything she had already received. When she composed herself enough, she would utter a few more words of appreciation, which would bring more grateful tears. She thanked him for her health, that she had reunited with Aunt Lucy, that she was with her family of sisters, that she had come to this marvelous country, and most of all, that she had a strong testimony of the gospel. After a few more minutes, she got to her feet, brushed off her skirt, and wiped her eyes. Then, looking around to see if anyone was aware of her, she noticed a lone horseman in the distance coming from the east toward camp. She strained her eyes to see if the rider was friend or foe. As the horse drew closer, she could see there was a white man in the saddle, but he seemed to be slumped over the neck of the horse. This scared her. Who was he? And was he sick or wounded or dead? She finally saw he wasn't going to pose any threat to her since he wasn't moving, except with the motion of the plodding horse. She turned and yelled in the direction of the tent. "Aunt Lucy, come quickly. We have a rider, and he appears to be in trouble." Lucy was outside hanging up clothes on their wagon wheels when she heard Eleanor and came running. When they got in close proximity of the horseman, Eleanor talked soothingly to the horse. "Good boy. Careful now. We just want to see who you're carrying." The man's face was shielded by his hat. "Help me pull him off," directed Eleanor. The two struggled to pull the man down to the ground. It was clear that he wasn't dead because he began to moan. Removing his hat, Eleanor finally got a good look at his anguished face. "President Tippets, is that you? Are you all right? How did you find us?" she questioned. President Tippets' eyes were swimming as he slurred, Amazon, immigrants, Amazon, immigrants. He's delirious, but it's clear he's been looking for our company, said Eleanor. With difficulty, they pulled him up to his feet and put his arms around their shoulders. Try to walk, President Tippets. He took a feeble step forward and then another. He was able to lean on them to walk, but there was no way he could walk by himself. He was too sick. Aunt Lucy, this is our company president I was telling you about, who stayed in Lexington to help the victims of the Saluda. I never thought we'd see him again. When they arrived at the tent, the other sisters helped Eleanor and Lucy put him inside. They marveled that President Tippets had rejoined them. He's really sick, isn't he? Said Phoebe, half crying. Susanna knelt down in front of the sisters. Twinsies, go climb in the wagon for a while and entertain yourselves, please. We've got to take care of President Tippets, and you'll just be underfoot. Will he be all right? Asked Fanny hopefully. I think so, said Eleanor. Pray for him. The twins accepted this challenge and obediently went to the wagon. What do you want me to do, Eleanor? Asked Lavinia. Tie up President Tippets' horse and then try to locate some dry blankets. Lavinia immediately left the tent and secured his horse behind their wagon. She then went to the wagons closest to theirs and inquired about any dry bedding they might share. President Tippets continued to mutter incoherent sentences as he shook and his teeth chattered. Let's get him out of these wet clothes, said Eleanor, as she and Aunt Lucy took off his jacket, vest, and shirt, and Susanna and Caroline each pulled off a boot and his wet stockings. Then they unbuckled his pants and pulled them off, leaving him in his drawers. Rub his legs and feet, Aunt Lucy said. All four sisters began to rub him vigorously. His body is so cold and damp, said Caroline. I hope we can warm him up. After a few minutes, they turned him over and worked on his back. I found 2 dry blankets, sisters, said Lavinia, bursting into the tent and seeing the women working on Tippets. Eleanor spread out the first blanket and placed it under him. The second one went over the trunk of his body. The sisters continued to rub him through the top blanket. Caroline, can you start a fire and get some water boiling? Asked Eleanor. I can try. We have a few buffalo chips in our covered bucket. Hopefully they didn't get too wet last night. See if you can make some thin cornmeal mush, Aunt Lucy directed. The sisters kept working on President Tippets. He was starting to get some warmth back on his skin, to his skin. When Caroline re-entered the tent in a few minutes, she was balancing a bowl in her hands between 2 cloths. You should have seen what I had to clean out of that cook kettle before I could make this mush. The windstorm put dirt in every crack and crevice, and when the rain came, it turned it into mud. That was quite a storm, all right, said Eleanor, propping President Tippets up so she could feed him some of the thin mush. He wasn't shaking like he was before, but was starting to perspire and come to his senses a little. Abby, where are the children? Where is John Henry? His eyes darted around the tent and fixed on Eleanor. She was disconcerted for a second or two, but thought quickly. You can see them after you eat something, dear, she lied. She dipped a spoon in the mush and touched it to his lips. He instinctively opened his mouth and accepted it eagerly. He's plenty hungry, said Susanna. Yes, he is, said Caroline. Who knows how long it's been since he's eaten anything? Eleanor continued feeding him spoonful after spoonful. I'll go and tell Captain MacArthur that President Tippets has rejoined us, offered Lavinia. After draining 3 bowls of mush, he was exhausted and fell back into a fitful sleep. In a while, Captains Andrew and MacArthur came to visit the sisters. Let's take a look at him, MacArthur said. Eleanor opened the tent flap and revealed Aunt Lucy mopping President Tippets' brow with a wet cloth. How's he doing, Sister Whittier? Asked Captain MacArthur. He's been sleeping for the last hour, but every once in a while he'll flail his arms and yell out words. Then he'll shake until his teeth chatter. We've been taking turns sitting by him. The captains knelt down beside him and felt his forehead. Does he alternate between chills and fever? Yes. Then he'll sweat and calm down just enough to go back to sleep. His nails are blue, Captain Andrews said upon inspection. I'd say he has ague. What do you think, Cap? Definitely. I'm sure we have some bottles of quinine in our teamster's supply wagon. It has helped in some cases. These bouts with ague can go on for weeks. Make sure you keep giving him water and broth. Let's give him a blessing, Captain Andrews. The 2 men anointed him, placed their hands on his head, and blessed him to be made well, if it be thy will. Do you have room to put him in the back of your wagon? Asked MacArthur after the prayer. We can make room, said Eleanor. I have a feeling we will be back on the trail by tomorrow. The sun is already showing through and getting unusually hot. "We'll be ready when you give the order," said Eleanor. "Thank you, captains," she said, shaking their hands. Eleanor spoke up. "I'll go with you and get the quinine, captains, and save you a trip back." "We'll come back tonight to check on him," Captain Andrews said as they left. "Susanna," said Eleanor, "can you and the twins start restacking our things in the wagon to make a place for President Tippett to lie down?" "Of course, Eleanor. That will be a wonderful project to keep me and the twins busy for the rest of the afternoon." Just as Captain MacArthur predicted, the trail dried up quickly, and by evening the Saints were informed that the Dixie train would be able to get back to trekking the very next day. President Tippett's bed in the back of the wagon was made as comfortable as the Watts sisters could make it, and he slept most of the time as the wagon rolled along its way. Each of the sisters took their turns walking along behind the wagon, to keep an eye on him. After riding in the wagon for a couple of days, the quinine seemed to be helping President Tippett's spell because his spells were occurring further and further apart. However, he still wasn't coherent. On the third day, it was the twins' turn to watch over him until the noon stop. When they saw how easy this task was, they got sidetracked, laughing and recalling some of the fun things they had done with the other children on the trek. They were soon brought back to attention when they noticed that President Tippett was trying to climb out of the wagon. "Susanna," yelled Phoebe, "help! President Tippett is going to fall." "Caroline, stop the wagon," Susanna ordered as she ran to the twins along with Lavinia. "Whoa!" could be heard from all the drivers following behind them. Together, the two sisters intercepted President Tippett and pushed him back inside. "Now, just what do you think you're doing, President Tippett?" questioned Susanna sternly. "The Amazon immigrants, do you know where they are?" "You just lie down, President," said Lavinia. "We're going to take you to them. We promise." This seemed to satisfy him, and he settled back down in his makeshift bed and dropped off to sleep again. "That was a close call, twinsies," scolded Susanna. "He could have fallen out and gotten trampled by Hurricane's oxen. You've got to pay closer attention when you're assigned to watch them." "We're sorry," they said remorsefully. Then Fanny added, "We just figured he was sleeping and everything was all right." "I'll take the next watch," said Lavinia. "We'll need to tell Eleanor and Aunt Lucy about this when they get back from their rounds." When the two nurses arrived back at noontime, they were concerned about this new behavior from President Tippett and were glad the train was stopped for a couple of hours. "Let's get him out of the wagon and see if he can't walk around a little," said Eleanor. "Maybe it will clear up his thinking." With Eleanor on one side, Aunt Lucy on the other, and the rest of the sisters following behind, they held him up. "Come on, President Tippett. You need to wake up and try to do some walking," said Aunt Lucy. They moved his body forward, but his legs stayed back. Then Lavinia bent down and moved his right foot ahead. When it was in place, Susanna moved his left foot ahead. He started to mutter a little. They kept him going for a few steps, and soon he was conscious enough to keep with his own footing. To help with his own footing. "That's it, President. You're doing great. Just keep walking," encouraged Eleanor as they took him in a large circle for several rounds. Finally, he spoke a coherent sentence. "I'm tired. I want to sit down." "Did you hear that, sisters?" said Aunt Lucy. "He wants to sit down." The sisters rejoiced. They walked him to the wagon and helped him sit down against one of the wheels. Aunt Lucy and Eleanor looked into his eyes, which were beginning to focus. He started to study the faces around him. "Who are you? You look familiar," he said weakly. "I'm Sister Wise. Remember me? I'm Sister Triplet. Sister Cleverly. I'm Sister Whittier. Sister Watts." "We're the twins," said Phoebe and Fanny together. He looked from one face to the next as they spoke. Then his eyes filled with tears. "7 sisters," he whispered. "Yes, 7 sisters," Eleanor smiled. "And the rest of the Amazon company is right here in camp with us." "Oh, I finally found you. Thank you, dear Lord," he said, looking upward. "I don't know how I got here, but I do remember buying a horse in Florence so I could catch up with you on the plains. I rode for weeks and sometimes spending the night with other wagon trains, mountain men, or just by myself until I got violently ill, and I don't remember much else after that." "You can tell us more about that later," said Aunt Lucy. "We don't want to tire you out." "It's so good to have you back with us," said Eleanor. "Are you hungry?" "I could eat a horse," he chuckled. "How about some deer jerky?" "That sounds even better. Thank you, thank you." Within another few days, President Tippett felt well enough to mount his horse and ride for an hour or two. He was getting stronger and stronger every day. He spent much of his writing time in front of the train with MacArthur and Andrews, learning about what had taken place with his company since they left Florence. He occasionally took messages from MacArthur back to the captains. Then, when Captain MacArthur invited him to ride ahead with the scouters one day, he eagerly accepted the invitation. He felt like he had returned to the living and was starting to pull his own weight on the Dixie train. That night he broke the news to the sisters that he had been officially called to be a scouter, and he would be joining the other scouters in their tent for the rest of the journey. The sisters were thrilled that his recovery had been so successful. He thanked them over and over again and promised to check in with them a couple of times a day just to let them know how he was doing. As he rode away, Aunt Lucy marveled. He really is a good man, isn't he? Eleanor pondered that thought for a moment. No, Aunt Lucy, I'd say he is a great man. That's the end of chapter 41. Over and